So my topic today is, can science be saved? And certainly many people have the impression that science needs to be saved, that there's a crisis in science, that young people don't want to go into science, that people don't trust science, that people won't get vaccinated, that people don't believe in climate change. Well, actually, although in some ways some of those things are true, the evidence, and we are an evidence-based crowd, the evidence doesn't actually support the conclusion that there's a crisis in science. In fact, the scientific enterprise in America, and in many parts of the world, is alive and well. So just consider for a minute the events of last year. First of all, scientists had an astonishing success in identifying the novel virus that was causing the COVID-19 disease. In just a few weeks, scientists were able to identify the virus that was causing the illness, and by sequencing its DNA. So think about that for a moment. When most of us were children, DNA sequencing technology did not even exist. And now it's routine. We just heard this morning about the amazing things that scientists are being able to do now simply by changing small snippets of our DNA. This is a powerful tool that we all take for granted, and it's a huge scientific success. Or think about the scientists' success in creating an effective vaccine. We just heard a moment ago about the importance and efficacy of the HPV vaccine. In under 1 year, under a year, scientists produced not just one, but several vaccines with astonishing levels of efficacy and safety. So these results show us that the scientific enterprise is working well, that scientists are there when we need them, and they do the jobs we need them to do. But you might say, well, okay, that's one thing. Scientists are doing well, but the crisis is a crisis of trust in science. We all know that's happening, right? No, actually not. The evidence shows that by and large, Americans still trust science. These are data from a study that was done by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a report called Perceptions on Science in America. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend that report to you. And it's based on data from the General Social Survey. So this is a survey of American opinions that goes back to the 1970s, in which Americans are asked all kinds of questions about all kinds of things. And since 1973, they have had a question on trust in science. And what these data show is that actually science, oops, hold on. No, I just messed up the clicker, just as I was warned I would. Okay, so here's science, this orange line here. The only organization that is more trusted than science is the US military. Science is far more trusted than banks, Congress, and of course the media. But what these studies also showed that a majority of Americans trust scientists to tell the truth, to conduct research in the best interests of humanity, to accurately report findings, and to give impartial evidence. In other words, the key things that we need scientists to do, people do, in fact, trust them to do. Now, sometimes people say, well, there's a gap between science and technology. Americans love technology, but we somehow disrespect the science that gives us those technologies. And so some science communicators have said that in order to improve trust in science, we should talk more about the technologies that we get from science. Well, I think there is good reason to talk about the relationship between science and technology, but the idea that there's a big gap between how people think about science and technology is not supported by the evidence. 71% of Americans say that government investments in basic scientific research pay off in the long run, and the number who say that about technology, sorry, this is my problem is I'm messing up this pointer with the clicker. The number who say the same about technology is almost identical, 72. So large proportions of the American people, nearly 3/4 of us, believe that science pays off in the long run, and we believe that technology investments pay off in the long run. And I don't have time today to talk about the rest of the world, just stick to the United States for now, but studies in other countries show roughly similar results. In general, most people around the globe value government investment in scientific research, and they think that their countries should be world leaders in science. Now here's the most important part of this. Many of us have the impression that this crisis of trust in science is something that has developed of late. That people used to have faith in science, but somehow have lost that confidence. Again, the data do not support that. Again, here's the line for science, this orange line here. Look at that. There is almost no change, statistically no change at all, since 1973. In fact, science is the most stable institution in this picture. There's been a big increase in trust in the military since the 1990s, probably related to the Iraq wars, and a big decrease in trust in journalism, banking, and government. But science, trust in science, is almost unchanged. So that's very different from what most of us think. So what's going on here? Why do so many of us have the impression of a crisis in science? Well, one reason has to do with the media. So it's easy to bash the media, but sometimes the media deserves bashing. Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who has done really important work analyzing media in America, have shown that the media have pushed this narrative of a crisis in science. Now, one of the ironies of this is that actually the science media have been at the forefront of pushing the notion of a crisis in science. So these are headlines that I gathered of articles that talked about a crisis of trust in science, science in trouble, a crisis, will science survive the pandemic? What is the crisis in science really about? These headlines all came from scientific journals and newspapers. So for reasons that I think I don't have time to go into, scientists themselves have actually misread or been unscientific about the state of science. So, as I said, the data do not support the conclusion of a general crisis of trust in science. And actually, I think this relates to something Lee said earlier this morning about when scientists go off-piste, or maybe it was David who said it. Actually, I think it was David. Americans don't usually use the term off-piste. We say off the reservation or off the ranch. When scientists go step outside of their expertise, often it's kind of like all hell breaks loose, and then they just say all kinds of opinions about their impressions without actually looking at the data. So when we talk about science as an enterprise, we need to be scientific in the same way we want to be scientific about specific claims in science. So what the data do support is something that's actually harder to talk about, which is a crisis of conservative trust in science. That is to say, a politicization of trust in science, or a political gap. Americans who self-identify as Republicans or conservatives do have very low levels of trust in science, and it's very different from Americans who identify as Democrats, liberals, or progressives. So one way to think about this is to think about the question of, to whom do we look for authority? When this question is posed to people, both in the United States and elsewhere, we find big differences in who people look to as authority figures, whether they self-identify as conservatives or liberals. So here in the United States, people who self-identify as liberal, 62% of them, I won't say us, them, 62% of people who identify as liberals have high degrees of trust in science. Whereas if you identify as being conservative or on the right wing, 75% of those folks say they have greatest trust in the military. So we're looking to different people, different groups for sources of authority. And similar patterns show up in other countries as well, although the gaps are greatest in the United States. So how should we understand this? Well, one way to understand this is to see how it's changed over time, because it wasn't always this way. Republicans, in fact, used to trust science more than Democrats and independents. Now they trust it less. In fact, there's been a complete reversal. And as a historian, this is one thing historians love. We love it when things change, and we love when they reverse, because it proves that it's not in our brains, it's not in our DNA, but it's something in our culture. There's no way our DNA can have changed that much in 20 years, but there can be big changes in culture and politics in 20 years. So what this chart comes, and this is a chart that my postdoc Alexander Sorov made for me based on data from the General Social Survey. So if you go back to the 1970s, red is Republicans, blue, this blue dash are Democrats, and then here are the independents. Republicans showed more trust in science than Democrats and independents, but that began to change in the late 90s, around the year, somewhere around in here. And then around the year 2000, Republican trust in science cratered. And conversely, Democratic trust in science was pretty stable right through about the year 2000, but around 2005, 2008, it begins to climb, and then it sort of skyrockets up in 2016, and well, we all know what happened there. So what happened? Why are these big changes, and how can we make sense of them? And why do conservatives distrust science now when they used to trust it? Well, what our research shows is what we've called implicatory denial. And by that we mean the selective rejection of science in specific areas, either because of its real implications or because of perceived implications. Not because the science is weak or too uncertain or otherwise inadequate, but because the science implies, or is thought to imply, things that people don't like. There are three areas that are very well studied. One is evolutionary biology, a second is climate change, and then a third, well, not as well studied, but we have starting to have good studies on it, is the whole set of issues around COVID-19, mask refusal, and vaccine hesitancy. So let's look at evolutionary biology first. This is the area that's been studied the longest and the most closely. So many people, particularly many scientists, think that evolutionary theory is rejected by, quote, religious people because it conflicts with the literal reading of the book of Genesis. But the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence shows that people's views about evolutionary theory, and particularly about the evolutionary status of Homo sapiens, is highly sensitive to how you word the question. Now, this is something that's known in social sciences, that if you ask a question differently, you can often get very different answers. Lawyers know this too, right? Which is why they'll object if a question is a leading question. But it's particularly true in areas that have to do with science and religion. So this comes from Pew Research, in which people were asked about evolution. And when you ask people a simple, what's known as a two-option approach, in which one of the options is that human beings have not evolved, that they've always existed exactly as they are today, fully 31% of Americans accept that position. So something that is completely incompatible with scientific findings. But if you reword the question and give people more options, including the options that humans have evolved, but maybe it was guided by a higher power, well, then the number who totally reject science falls dramatically to only 18%. Now, I'm not saying that middle option is correct, but it goes to show that it's very easy to make a situation seem more black and white than it really is. What we see is that most Americans do accept that evolution has occurred, and they even accept that people have evolved too. They're not just saying that it's only the plants and animals that evolved. They understand that we've evolved too, but they're kind of reluctant to leave God out of the situation entirely. And that's what I call Homo sapien exceptionalism. They don't think we need God to get frogs and toads, but we kind of need God to get people. And this is consistent with previous studies that show that evolution skepticism is not, for the most part, driven by literal readings of the Bible. People who reject evolutionary theory do not think that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days. Most people do not believe that. But it does invoke views about God in evolution, and especially in our lives. The question of whether there is some higher power here or not. Are we really alone or not? So why is this important? So just to recapitulate this, so Americans who are skeptical about evolutionary theory do so not because they reject the science, but because what they reject is what they see as its implications, that there's no God, that life is random. David just spoke about this. People don't like randomness. They like the idea that someone's in charge. Why that is, I don't really know, but there it is. They think evolution implies that life has no meaning, or as Rick Santorum once put it, evolution makes humans into mistakes of nature, which I kind of like that because it was the only time I ever agreed with Rick Santorum, because I think a lot of my colleagues are mistakes of nature. But the reality is that not one of these conclusions actually follows from the science. Science does not and cannot disprove the existence of God. Science does not tell us the meaning of life. And I say this as a person who loves science and has dedicated my whole life to science. Science does not tell us if people are mistakes, even if we know that some of them are. Because these are not scientific questions. These are philosophical questions, metaphysical questions, and theological questions. And conflating them is what philosophers would call a category error. In other words, a good deal of the rejection of evolutionary theory arises from mistaken conceptions of what a scientific theory can and cannot do. Now, admittedly, those mistaken conceptions are perpetuated by some scientists, but they also can be corrected. One way we can correct it is by acknowledging these intellectual distinctions. And here I draw on the work of colleagues at the National Center for Science Education and Arizona State University, who have done experiments in classrooms with students where teachers acknowledge these distinctions, that the existence of God is not a scientific question, and that evolutionary theory does not take a position on theological matters. Some scientists believe in God, some do not. You can assign readings to students by scientists who are themselves people of faith, like the late Sir John Houghton, Francis Collins at the NIH, the great Ken Miller, who has written so eloquently about evolutionary theory, and the climate scientist Catherine Cahill, who's also an evangelical Christian. And when you do this, you find that student resistance to learning about evolutionary theory is greatly lessened, and in some cases eliminated completely. When students hear, oh, I can be a scientist and also a person of faith, then they're all in to learn science. So what I'm saying is we can address implicatory denial by showing that there are other ways to interpret the alleged implications. And this is very different from simply giving people more factual information, or trying to refute a particular creationist argument, like arguments about the evolution of the eye. Is that how much time I have left? Yeah, not how much I've used. Okay, just checking. Time flies when you're having fun. Arguing the details of evolution misses the point. Distinguishing between the physical and the metaphysical, or the scientific and the theological, gets at the point. Now let's turn to climate change, the issue that I've worked on most directly. There's a similar pattern here. Many scientists have thought that skepticism over climate change, and I shouldn't really say skepticism because it's not skepticism. We're skeptics. These people are science rejectors. So the rejection of scientific evidence of climate change is driven by scientific uncertainty. I have heard many scientists say words to the effect, well, if only we could narrow the error bars, then people would believe the science. And the scientific community has worked very hard to reduce the uncertainties and to explain them much more clearly. So some of you may know the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has huge documents, pages and pages and pages, on what they call uncertainty guidance, to explain to people what the uncertainties are around climate science. But as in evolution, this misdiagnoses the problem. Again, we have to look at the problem of political polarization. So when we ask people about climate change, most Americans do see climate change as a major threat in a way that's consistent with what the scientific community has been telling us. But that increased concern is concentrated almost entirely among Democrats. So we see that in recent years, 88% of Democrats have views that are more or less consistent with the scientific communities, but only 31% of Republicans do. So why is there this huge polarization? Well, the polarization about climate science reflects a larger polarization that has taken place about environmental and public health issues generally. These are data from the League of Conservation Voters that tracks how members of Congress have voted on environmental issues going back to 1970. And again, here we have Republicans in red, Democrats in blue. If you go back to 1970 when the Cleaner Act was passed, the Cleaner Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, all kinds of important legislation passed at this time, protecting the nation's air, water, and other things, natural areas. What we see is that there was some tendency of Democrats to vote more strongly for environmental protection, but the gap between Democrats and Republicans was not that large, maybe 10 to 15 percentage points on average. And it starts to diverge a little bit in the 80s, but not that much. It's still pretty much the same until 1990. And then there's this catastrophic change, big, huge change, where Democrats start supporting environmentalism very, very strongly, and Republicans the exact mirror image. So here today we have Democrats almost completely aligned with environmental protection, and Republicans almost completely against it. These are enormous numbers. In social sciences, in the area I work, if we get a 5% spread in a poll result, we're really happy. That's really significant. And this is a spread of about 80%. So it's gigantic. And here's the thing. This polarization has spread while the scientific uncertainty, so the polarization has increased while the scientific uncertainties have decreased. So 1988 is when Jim Hansen first testified in Congress that climate change was underway. 1990, the first IPCC report. 1995 is when the IPCC says for sure that climate change is underway. So the science is getting stronger and the polarization is getting bigger. So in our book, Merchants of Doubt, Eric Conway and I explained this, and we showed that this was, again, a case of implicatory denial. And it was rooted in commitments, economic, cultural, political commitments to free market economics. The belief that our problems are best solved in the private sector, not by government. And coupled with a worry or a fear or an anxiety that government action to address environmental problems like acid rain, the ozone hole, climate change, would compromise political freedom. It was rooted, we showed, in Cold War anxieties about containing communism, the fear that government regulation would be a backdoor, a slippery slope to socialism or worse. And these folks, these merchants of doubt, who spread doubt about the reality of climate change, saw environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. And this then led to, it helps to explain the Republican alignment with climate change denial, rooted in the fear that it would lead to policies that Republicans opposed, not because the science was weak. In fact, I would argue the opposite, because the science was so strong that it seemed to demand, and some scientists did in fact claim that it demanded, policies like carbon taxes or stricter regulations that conservatives did not like. So rather than accept the need for those policies, they rejected the science that pointed to the need. So how do we address this? So this is trickier than evolutionary biology, because climate change is a market failure. And in that sense, it really does challenge the conservative belief in free markets. In this case, unlike evolutionary biology, the perceived implications aren't entirely wrong. Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic climate change the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. And market failures require exogenous solutions, that is to say, solutions that come from outside the marketplace. In other words, governments have to do something. So here's the answer that I've been using that I find has been effective, at least with some communities, to point out that climate change denial is misdirection. And all of us here know that magic works by misdirection, but it's kind of fun in magic because we have a good time and then we go home knowing it was just a magic show. But in this case, it's very damaging and dangerous. The fossil fuel industry is not a free market. Fossil fuels are incredibly heavily subsidized. Currently, the United States gives the fossil fuel industry anywhere between $5 and $62 billion every year in direct subsidies. And when we account for the indirect subsidies, such as the public health impacts and climate change, the handout could be as much as $650 billion. Globally, the International Monetary Fund estimates that the world spends about $5 trillion every year on fossil fuels, energy subsidies, and that's mostly for fossil fuels. So climate change deniers are distracting us from the realities of market failure, the realities of the cost of climate change. Okay, well, what about COVID-19 and mask mandates? What's that about? Well, again, the issue is highly polarized. Even more than evolutionary biology and climate change, mask rejection aligns with the radical individualism that characterizes a lot of conservative thinking in this country. And it aligns with conservative rejection of mandates generally, and it tracks with a hostility towards big government. We don't have a lot of good survey data on this yet, but we have evidence from rallies, from protests, from articles people have written. And what we saw particularly in the early days of the pandemic, was mass rejection expressed as individualism and personal rights, as a defiance of tyranny, and as hostility to so-called big government, particularly the federal government. So in all of this, there is rejection of science, but it's not primarily driven by lack of trust in science. In fact, the other way around. I would say that science, the rejection of science is the consequence of these other belief problems. The rejection of science is driven by theological, political, ideological, and personal concerns. So what does this mean? What does this mean for us, people who believe in science and do believe that science makes us healthier, wealthier, and, well, I don't know about wiser, but at least healthier and wealthier? So for the majority of Americans who do still trust science, facts do count. So if anyone tells you facts don't count, that's not true. And Lee spoke about this morning, especially for teachers who are trying to teach people the truth about the world we live in, facts remain extremely important. And it behooves the scientific community and those of us who support the scientific community to provide good quality information in formats that non-experts can understand. But for the minority who are motivated by non-empirical concerns, non-evidential concerns, our outreach must recognize those concerns, particularly insofar as, in some cases, they may at least in part be valid. After all, I don't really want the government telling me what to do either. So for scientists, then, it means as much as possible to try as much as possible to communicate findings without telling people what to do, and especially without being hostile or condescending towards their religious or political beliefs, even, or maybe even especially if you disagree with them. For all of us, as much as possible, explain what we know without telling other people what to do, unless, of course, they ask you. And sometimes people do ask me what to do, and then I'm all in. But this is why I cringe when I hear people talk about, quote, what the science tells us, that we have to do what the science tells us we have to do. Science does not tell us what we have to do. Science tells us what the consequences of our actions are likely to be. Climate science, for example, tells us that if we continue business as usual, burning fossil fuels, the consequences are likely to be dire. In fact, in many parts of the world, they already are becoming dire. And it tells us that if we don't get vaccinated, we will get sick, and we may well die. Thank you very much for your time.